Greetings, everyone. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to the 30 greatest UK bands of all time. That's right. You knew the sequel to the 30 greatest American bands was coming up soon. And of course, it's no big secret that some of my favorite bands of all time are indeed bands from the UK, British bands, Irish bands, that's Scottish bands, that sort of thing, right? I have this amazing love for bands from the UK. I always have, and most of my favorite bands happen to be from there. I love a lot of American bands, as you saw on the American show, but my absolute top favorites generally are from the UK. It's just the way it is. I didn't plan it that way. It just works out that way. So a little bit of housekeeping and the rules here. So I am picking my 30, what the 30 bands that I consider to be not only the most important, but also among my favorites. I have to like them. If I'm not a fan of the band, newsflash, they're not going to appear on this list. So for everybody, it's going to be like, Pete, you absolutely have to include Oasis on this list. No, I don't. I recognize how big Oasis is and have been. If you love them, put them in your own list. I'm not a fan at all. So I'm not going to include them on my list. Yes, big sales, influential, huge band over the last 30, 35 years. I get it. I acknowledge it. They're not on my list, though, right? There's also a lot of great British bands that maybe are way under the radar, right? They're favorite bands of mine. I love them, but, they were never a big band. They're not, never big sellers, not much of an impact on the scene. So, as much as I love a band like Carcass, Carcass is not going to make my top 30 list, right? I love Carcass. There's a lot of, underground metal bands that were British that I love, but they may not make my list, right? That's just kind of the way I'm doing this, right? So I have to really like the band, and I also have to understand and accept how impactful these bands were. So it's partially favorites, partially impactful, put them together. There's my list, right? So let's get started. I'm going to go from number 30 all the way to number one. My first band that I'm going to talk about today is a band that I honestly, if we would have done this a year, two or three ago, probably wouldn't have made my list. But I've started listening to the band. I've always been very well aware of them, and I always like their singles, but I've started getting more into their albums, and that is T-Rex. Okay, Mark Bolan and company. A really, really important band to what we call now is glam rock, right? Originally started as a psychedelic folk band and eventually got rid of it as the name Tyrannosaurus Rex, mainly just a duo. After four albums, they decided to incorporate lots more of electric instruments, build up the band to a four-piece, change the name, shorten the name, made the band lineup bigger, but shortened the band name to T-Rex. And here they became this kind of pop, psychedelic rock, glam rock, power pop kind of phenomenon. And of course, Mark Bolan became the kind of like the signature person in the band, became kind of like a sex symbol, a very bizarre figure that captivated millions and millions of listeners. And yeah, very, very influential band to this day, and really damn good guitar player. I almost wish there was more Guitar Hero stuff in their music. But yeah, that's my pick number 30 is T-Rex. Let's go find my pick number 29. Bear with me as I'm scattering through Prezi here to find the images of my bands is always the most time-consuming thing. I try to get these in some kind of order, but I haven't been able to figure that out. Number 29 is The Police. All right, so obviously a great power trio, but defied everything we think of as a power trio. One of the great kind of post-punk pop bands of all time. Only a handful of albums, every one of them so important, so impactful, so popular, almost impossible. Oh, and I forgot to, I'm usually picking my favorite albums here. For T-Rex, I'm going to go with Electric Warrior, though I'm not 100% set on that being my favorite T-Rex album because I like a lot of them, and but they're all like kind of weird and different. And that's the one that everybody picks. So I'm going to do that today. But I still, because I'm going to be doing a, T-Rex ranking the album show with Grant Arthur down the road. I still have not decided on what's my favorite T-Rex album as of yet. But anyway, back to the Police. Yeah, so many hit singles. Uh, trying to pick a favorite album from them is also quite difficult because every one of them makes a case for being like the best in the catalog, the favorite in the catalog. Today, I'm going to go with Zenyatta Mondatta. I have probably changed my pick for my favorite Police album more times than I care to admit. I always seem to make a case for another one, and then another one and another one, but they're all really good. So many great songs. Of course, Sting and Company, right? The classic, classic band has to be on this list. Next up for number 28, we're going to go with a band that you can't have a list of the best, the greatest British bands of all time or best UK bands of all time with arguably one of the greatest power trios of all time. That is Motorhead. Right? Of course, this is the original lineup. Well, the classic lineup, not really the original, not quite the original. Lemmy on bass and vocals, Filthy on drums, and Fast Eddie Clarke on guitars, right? Other lineups afterwards, this configuration would only be together for a handful of albums, but man, so important. Uh, call them what you want. Lemmy always said, we're just a rock and roll band, right? Call them heavy rock, punk rock, biker rock, heavy metal. They will always be beloved and accepted as a metal band by all of us metalheads, even though so many people try to insist that they were never a metal band. Come on. They hung out with all the metal bands. They played festivals with all the metal bands. They toured with all the metal bands. I mean, yeah, their music encompasses a lot more than that. Filthy, angry, dirty, grungy rock and roll. That was Motorhead. Amazing band, never the biggest sellers ever, but so influential, so important. And most people you talk to who have even a remote interest in heavy music love and worship Motorhead. And sadly, all three guys from this lineup of the band are now gone. My favorite album, without question, is Overkill, their second album. It's an absolute drop dead classic, folks. If you haven't heard it, you need to. So that is my pick number 28. Next up for 27, let me find them here. This is another band that I guess you could say one of the forefathers of, kind of along with T-Rex and, David Bowie, one of the creators of this whole thing we call glam rock early on. I would say they morphed into a very, very good hard rock, heavy rock, even proto metal band, as well as they could do pop too, as well, early on in their career, kind of bubblegum pop. I'm talking about Sweet, of course. So many great singles early on, and then all of a sudden they started releasing these, they started saying, we're going to write our own songs. We're going to dial up the guitars a couple of notches. We've got these wonderful, bunch of singers in the band, all the great vocal harmonies. I don't know, do we really get Queen the way we get Queen if it wasn't for Sweet? I don't know. Such an important band. They had the glam look. Some of their songs had that pop sheen to it, but man, they could bring out the guitar thunder and rock a lot, and so many great albums and songs all throughout the decade. Such and such a great band. And I'm going to pick Sweet Fanny Adams as my favorite Sweet album. But man, you could make a case for any number of them, right? Because they're just so good. What a great, great band. So that is my pick number 27. My pick number 26. I'm going to go to a band that kind of morphed out of the ashes of another band. And that other band was called The Move. The Move does not quite make my list here, but this band certainly does. I've been a fan since I was a young kid. I still listen to them a lot to this day. That is the Electric Light Orchestra, otherwise known as ELO for short. Of course, Jeff Lynne and Bev Bevan coming over from The Move, right? Originally with Roy Wood as well. Roy drops out pretty early on. And basically, they took kind of what the Move was doing, which is combining psychedelic music with pop music, heavily inspired by the Beatles, as well as classical music, right? So, this kind of thing that sometimes people want to call it progressive rock. I guess you could if you want. Amazing keyboards from Richard Tandy. You got the violin, you got the cello, you got the guitar, you got keyboards, drums, and bass. Amazing vocals, great lush Beatles harmony. Some of the stuff rocks out. Some of the stuff has a kind of a classical beat. Some of it's haunting and dark. Eventually, they also embraced things like disco and electronic music. I love them. My favorite album is Out of the Blue, but again, a lot of great albums throughout the 70s. An amazing, amazing band. Had to make my list. Next up for pick number 25, this is another band that basically morphed from an even bigger band, but this band would go on to create and make a huge name for themselves all throughout the 70s. and really, especially with this with their hit singles. I mean, their albums sold really, really well as an addition, but so many great songs. And that band is, let me get into their picture here. Where are they? They're not showing up. Oh boy. Oh, here we go. That band is Wings, right? Paul McCartney and Wings, Paul's group after the breakup of the Beatles. He would form this band with Linda McCartney, his wife, Denny Lane, right? See a lot of other people kind of come and go. Here you've got Jimmy McCullough as well on guitar. Great, great guitar player who came over from Thunderclap Newman. I mean, so many great songs, lots of hit singles, silly love songs, Let 'Em In, right? My Love, Band on the Run. I mean, we know all of this, so many killer, killer tracks, so many singles. They became a very, very big band. It's almost a stadium band right by the middle of the 70s. And yeah, just Paul was just his writing was peaking, just all sorts of hit singles and best-selling albums. Unfortunately, by the end of the 70s, that would be the end of the band, right after the big pot bust in Japan when the band was set to start their tour over there. That would pretty much bring an end to the Wings band. But yeah, so much great music. Band on the Run is going to be my pick for my favorite album. But you know, Venus and Mars is up there too, and I still to this day say Wings Over America, the triple live album, is one of the greatest live albums of all time. So yeah, that's my pick there. So Wings at number 25. Number 24. Here's a band that may surprise some of you who've been following me on the channel for a while that I would throw them on here. And it's a band that I have a lot of respect for the early part of their catalog. I kind of fell off their music, though, by the mid 80s. And even though I haven't had a lot of good things to say about a lot of their catalog post those first few, I still think that they're so important to the UK hard rock scene and being a big part of the early new wave of British heavy metal. And again, so many people argue they were never a metal band, but you know what? They were part of that scene early on. That band, of course, is Def Leppard, and you know what? If they never released anything else after Pyromania, and I know a lot of people love Hysteria and some of those other albums that came afterwards, to me, that kind of goes into it takes them into an area that I'm less interested in. But man, On Through the Night, High and Dry, and Pyromania are landmark albums. They're great albums, and I still love listening to them to this day. And you know, what a kick-ass band they were. And you know, they eventually they started work using much, much more commercial elements in their music and you know, kind of lost my interest there as I look at all these deer running across the road across from me. Um, and my favorite album is High and Dry from Def Leppard. So yeah, Joe Elliott and company. Just that is a great kick-ass hard rock album, one of the great hard rock albums of the 80s. So I had to put them on my list. So that is pick number 24. Pick number 23. So we're going to talk about a band that I always felt should have been way more successful than what they actually attained, specifically here in the States. I always thought they had all the talent in the world and amazing players, amazing songwriters, and some great albums that had so many killer songs, but for whatever reason, they never became as big as other bands, other heavy bands of the 70s, like Zeppelin and Queen and, you know, Bad Company and so on and so forth. And that band is UFO. Of course, this to me is their absolute classic lineup, right? You got Phil Mogg on vocals, the great Michael Schenker, who, of course, not a UK. He's the only non-UK person here. He is German, but this was a UK band, true and true. We've got Paul Raymond on keyboards and guitars. You got Pete Way on bass and Andy Parker on drums. This is the classic lineup. Together, this lineup did those amazing albums, you know, Lights Out and Obsession, and of course the live album Strangers in the Night. Uh, great, great stuff. Force It, No Heavy Petting, Phenomenon, great albums earlier, a couple early kind of space rock, blues rock albums. But man, most of those 70s albums and a lot of the 80s albums too, absolutely amazing. Just a band that just never quite made the big time and they always should have. My favorite album by them is Obsession. Love UFO to death. Such a great band. Such a great band. All right. Kind of along the same lines, another band that had all the tools, so many great albums, so many great songs, amazing musicianship, and they just could never catch a break. Every time it seemed like they were, you know, ready to do something big, someone in the band would get sick, tours would get canceled, things got delayed, and for Thin Lizzy from Ireland, it just never quite happened. You had the one pretty big album, Jailbreak, and a bunch of other albums that are probably just as good, right? But just never really, other than, they were pretty big in the UK. Here, more of a cult band, never really rose above being an opener, never a big headliner. And really the one hit single here in the States, that's about it. But man, a lot of us here in the States absolutely love this band. Of course, the great twin guitar attack, Scott Gorham and Brian Robertson. Of course, Scott is American. Brian is a Scot. You got Phil and Mr. Downey are both Irish. Of course, Gary Moore would come in and out of the band a couple times, and he, of course, is Irish as well. But yeah, an amazing band, great hard rock band, amazing twin guitars, so influential. Uh, I hope someday, like the entire universe realizes just how great Thin Lizzy was. And it's just a shame that while they were still a band, they just never quite got that recognition that they always deserved. Along with UFO, I think two of the great unsung hard rock bands of the 70s into the early mid 80s that just never quite broke through like some of their contemporaries, sadly. All right, that's number 22. Right, was that 22? Yes, that was 22. Let's go on to 21. So we're going to move over to prog rock now, and we're going to talk about a band that were one of the original supergroups, another power trio that kind of formed out of the ashes of the Nice, Crazy World of Arthur Brown, King Crimson, and Atomic Rooster. That man is Emerson, Lake, and Palmer. Keith Emerson, Greg Lake, Carl Palmer, one of the great prog rock bands of all time. Let's create this music that's like a classical symphony meets with rock, meets with pop, bombastic, over the top keyboards from Keith Emerson, right? The wonderful vocals of Greg Lake and really good bass playing too, and the acrobatic and powerful drum skills of Carl Palmer. Mandatory progressive rock listening for anybody looking to get into prog. Another one of those bands that I constantly go back and forth about which is actually my favorite album in the catalog. There are some days I am convinced the debut is it. There are some days I'm convinced it's Trilogy. I've picked Tarkus in the past mainly because of the title track, but some of the other stuff I'm not as up with. But man, Brain Salad Surgery I just seem to lean on that a lot in recent years. So I'm going to go with Brain Salad Surgery here. So that is my pick for number 21. Number 20. Here is a band that I have long been a huge fan of. And, another band that had a good amount of success throughout the 70s, even a little bit in the 80s. They are probably, out of all these bands we're talking about today, I think the one that has really persevered over the years and just become such a mainstay of the hard rock scene. And in their current incarnation, which has been together for a long time, actually, have created so many great late period albums. And there's still a force to be reckoned with live on stage. But, everybody goes back to those classic 70s albums for a reason. And that band is Uriah Heep. All right, so here is the classic lineup, right? We got the late great Lee Kerslake on drums, the late great Ken Hensley on keyboards and vocals, the late great David Byron on vocals, the still amazing Mick Box on guitars, and the late great Gary Thane on bass. Sadly, four of the five of this classic lineup are no longer with us. So many great albums. You could say Demons and Wizards. You could say The Magician's Birthday. You could say Very Heavy, Very Humble. You could say Salisbury. You could say Abominog. You can say any one of the more recent albums. They're all great. But I got to go with Look at Yourself, their third album, as being my ultimate favorite. It's heavy. It's so good. The writing's great. The vocals are outstanding. Just a killer album from a killer band. Uriah Heep, whether you call them heavy rock or proto metal or progressive rock, psychedelic rock, whatever, they do it all. An amazing band. Those vocal harmonies just so outstanding. All right, my number 19. We're going to go back to prog rock here. This is a band that you could arguably say created the first ever progressive rock album of all time, through and through. I don't know if too many people would argue this one. There are other bands that kind of dabbled in this thing called prog, but I think really the one band that probably more than anybody else kind of created prog, and that is King Crimson. Right? Can make a case for the Moody Blues, right? I'm going to talk about them in a minute. Um, but for me, I think King Crimson Again, there are other prog rock bands who sold way more records, concert tickets, all that sort of thing. But with the in the core of the Crimson King, that just kind of spearheaded a whole movement, right? Dark, angular music, Mellotron used at its most ominous and spooky. Great vocals, Greg Lake on that debut album, right? Just such an amazing, haunting, powerful album. And then, of course, you have a whole bunch of albums to follow. Lots of different lineups. I personally happen to love this lineup right here. This is, of course, John Wetton on bass and vocals, Bill Bruford on drums, coming over from Yes, Robert Fripp, the genius, on electric guitar and mellotron, David Cross on violin and mellotron, right? And Jamie Muir on percussion and all sorts of weird things and whatnot. We lost Jamie not too long ago too. Yeah, just amazing, amazing band. Whether you like, this stuff or whether you like the stuff, the 80s material, Discipline era band, maybe you like the jazzier stuff from the earlier, before this period, maybe you like the Crushing Red. I'm going to go with Lark's Tongues and Aspic. That's been my kind of go-to King Crimson album for a number of years now as my favorite. Just absolutely fantastic. So yeah, King Crimson, gotta be on this list. Next up for pick number 18. So I'm going to go with another real favorite band of mine that kind of divides a lot of people because this, like some of these other bands, this particular group had lots of different lineups. And some people, depending on where you live, favor one lineup over another or various different lineups that they've done. Um, I kind of, being an American, I kind of came in with the band when they were putting out albums that were a little bit more geared towards the American audiences. A lot of folks in the UK kind of, I like the earlier albums because they're more bluesy. That's the band. That's the part of the era of the band I really, really like. Whatever era you like, you can't say that Whitesnake does not belong on this list. One of the great bluesy hard rock bands of all time, of course, led by David Coverdale, formerly of Deep Purple. I happen to really love, and again, I love the earlier version of the band, with Bernie Marsden and Mickey Moody on the twin lead guitars. Love it. Just love all that stuff. But for me, my favorite lineup of the band, it was really short-lived too. They created the Slide It In American version album, right? So, of course, we've got Neil Murray on bass, John Sykes, the late great John Sykes on guitar, Cozy Powell, the late great Cozy fucking Powell on drums, Coverdale, John Lord on keyboards, and the late great Mel Galley on guitars, formerly of Trapeze, right? To me, this is an amazing, super, super lineup. They produced the Slide It In album, the American version. Of course, the UK version has Mickey Moody in place of John Sykes, right? So they kind of got that little weirdness going on here. And of course, this lineup would only stay together for a brief amount of time before Mel had issues with his hand or his arm, and he had to drop out. And the rest is kind of history there. But yeah, I love Whitesnake to death. And Slide It In is my favorite Whitesnake album. It overtook the 1987 self-titled Whitesnake album for the first time. That was one of my favorite albums of all time. And over the last like 2 years, Slide It In has become my favorite Whitesnake album. Maybe it's just because I've heard the 87 album just way too much. And over time, I've just realized how much that Slide It In album just really means to me. It just keeps getting better with age. So yeah, that's my pick. Number 18, Whitesnake. Number 17. So I mentioned this band before, a very important band to the history of progressive rock for sure. But I think more than that, I think that this particular band just so important in incorporating orchestral elements in with psychedelic pop music. And that band is the Moody Blues. So important. I think their importance to progressive rock is a little bit overstated because honestly, other than the fact that they used Mellotron in a lot of their early music, I don't think really their music is all that proggy, but it's really, really good, like classical inspired orchestral symphonic rock music and pop music. And there's lots of psychedelic elements as well. I mean, look at that string of albums, starting with Days of Future Past, right, going all through the 70s. Every one of them is just fantastic. Great. You got a couple of guys singing in the band. You got great pop stuff. You got kind of the cool, quirky psych stuff, and you got the big orchestral, symphonic stuff. Using orchestras and mellotron, right? Mike Pinder on the mellotron, so important. Yeah, I've always found it hard picking like a favorite album among them because they're so good. But I'm going to go with In Search of the Lost Chord. That's kind of the one that I lean to a little bit more. But the Moody's, a great, great band and so important. And, whatever you call them, they deserve to be among this list. All right, what are we at? Number 16. All right, one of my favorite bands of all time. And they are undeniably a very British sounding band, for sure. I don't think anybody would deny that the music of this band, with its acoustic guitars and crushing electric guitars and keyboards and flute and those unmistakable vocals of Mr. Ian Anderson, Jethro Tull have to be on this list. So many great albums, whether you love the early bluesy stuff, whether you love the more bluesy rock stuff, whether you love the bombastic prog rock stuff, whether you love their great kind of folky prog stuff, whether you like their more electronic early 80s stuff or their back to roots stuff of more recent times. This catalog is filled with such great stuff. And again, Toe were a really big band in the 70s. For a number of years, they were like, headlining Madison Square Garden and playing the big arenas and selling platinum albums left and right, hit singles and things like that. And nobody else sounds like them. They were so unique. They still are to this day. Yeah, other bands have used flute and done folky stuff and all that, blah, blah, blah. But man, nobody like Tull. Let's mix like heavy metal bombast with folk music, with blues, with little bits of jazz and pop, and just put it all in a blender. Boom, there you go, Jethro Tull. I always, along with some other bands we talked about today, my favorite album for Tull always changes. Sometimes it's Thick as a Brick. Sometimes it's Benefit. Sometimes it's Aqualung. Lately, I've been loving Minstrel in the Gallery the last couple of years. Um, I'm gonna lean on Aqualung today once again because I think Aqualung is just undeniably so great from start to finish. But man, I get this feeling that like Minstrel in the Gallery is going to kind of push Aqualung aside. But then you know what? A year from now, I'll be like, Thick as a Brick is back, baby. So whichever one you like, that's cool. I love so many of their albums, but yeah, I'm going to lean with Aqualung to this day. It could change tomorrow, though. Next up, number 15. All right, we're halfway through here. I'm going to go with a band that one of the great prog bands of all time. We're talking about a lot of them today. But this particular group has some albums that are listed by many as being absolute classics of the scene. And yeah, I wouldn't argue that at all. And in fact, one of their albums I think is the absolute greatest prog album of all time. That band is Yes. That album is Close to the Edge. This you might argue which is the classic lineup of the band. Could be this one, or you could take Alan White back out of the drum kit and insert Bill Bruford there, right? But the rest of those guys here, John Anderson, Chris Squire, Steve Howe, Rick Wakeman, yeah, that's the you got to have those four guys, right, for it to be the classic Yes lineup. But we know that Bill Bruford's time in the band was not all that long. Meanwhile, Alan White, the late great Alan White, manned the drum kit for many, 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 many years for Yes. But yeah, whether you like Relayer, right, without Wakeman, with Patrick Moraz, or whether you like Tales from a Topographic Oceans or the Yes album, or whatever your favorite Yes album is, they're one of the great UK bands of all time and one of the great UK prog bands of all time. So influential to so many other bands to follow. So yeah, Yes is on my list of number 15. My number 14. Well, we're going to stay on prog here, folks, and we're going to talk about, when we're talking about like bands and not so much albums, I generally only regard one other band over Yes when it comes to my favorite prog band. And that band is Genesis. Uh, I absolutely, absolutely adore Genesis's 70s output. I will say, I think that if you look at like the entire discography of Yes and Genesis, I probably have more albums in the discography of Yes that I really, really love over Genesis just because of the sheer numbers, right? The Genesis 80s albums, I like some stuff from those, but I find a couple of them to be rather weak, but there are great songs in some of them. But man, for me, Trespass, Nursery Crime, Foxtrot, Selling England by the Pound, Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, Trick of the Tail, Wind and Wuthering, even and then there were three, and Duke, and you could say the self-titled Genesis and Abacab. Man, those are just great, great stuff on those albums. I just absolutely love it. I lean towards this lineup here. Peter Gabriel, Tony Banks, Phil Collins, Steve Hackett, and Michael Rutherford. To me, this is one of the great lineups of all time. I lean towards that. But you take Gabriel out and you put Phil Collins behind the microphone, you still got some great stuff there. I've always felt that once Hackett left the band, they really lost something, but still, an amazing band. So unique, so quirky, so theatrical, so different, right? Mellotrons and Hammond organ and great guitars and 12-string acoustic guitars and songs about hogweeds and, getting out by Friday and, you know, the Slippermen and all this kind of stuff. Crazy stuff, but yet it's so endearing. It's so wonderful. So yeah, Genesis, and my favorite album is Foxtrot from Genesis. So Genesis is my number 14. My number 13, I probably like some of these other bands a little bit more than this band I'm going to name next, but they're so important, and I do really like them a lot. But I had to edge them over a couple of these prog bands because I just think that the career and the history of the Kinks so important to the UK music scene. Unfortunately, it never really translated well over here in the States. I've gone on record. I did a whole ranking show of the Kinks catalog, and I know a lot of UK folks were very upset by my ranking because I ranked higher the stuff that was more of their kind of albums that they were kind of pushing to try and get that US success, that North American success. Whereas the early stuff, the very British sounding albums, I don't like as much because they're just really different. They're very quirky and very British sounding, and there's nothing wrong with that because, like I said, I love British bands and a lot of British music. But I like the more kind of stadium ready Kinks. That's because that's where I started listening to them. Right, I started listening to albums like Low Budget and all that, Sleepwalker and all that. Give the people what they want. That's where I got turned on to the Kinks. That great live album, right? So that's where I lean. There's a lot of magical stuff in the early part of the catalog. I don't deny it. I love a lot of those early albums. But for me, like Low Budget is my favorite Kinks album. I think this band so important along with the Beatles and the Stones and the Who and the Pretty Things, right? Pretty Things didn't make my list, but another really, really good band. The Yardbirds. The Yardbirds didn't quite make my list either because it's just a small output. But man, the Kinks. Never really big here. One of the great singles bands in the UK. And again, never really a big album seller, which is really strange. I always thought that the Kinks albums sold a lot more, not only here, but over there, over across the pond, but never really the case. But as far as a singles band, wow, tons of hit singles, tons of them. So yeah, the Kinks are my number 13. My number 12. All right. We're going to go back to power trio stuff here, arguably the greatest and original power trio of all time. And again, they weren't around together all that long, but boy, the impact of Cream, one of the great, maybe the original supergroup, Ginger Baker, Jack Bruce, and Eric Clapton. Do we get like heavy rock and heavy metal without kind of what these guys were doing, along with the Jimi Hendrix Experience and some stuff that Eric was doing with the Blues Breakers and bands like Blue Cheer and Iron Butterfly, right? All these bands kind of doing some stuff that was heavier than anything we had ever heard at the time. But man, Cream were kind of doing it all first, man. Those big riffs and searing solos from Eric Clapton, the live interplay between these three guys, soloing like mad, taking these little songs and blowing them up into 15 minutes long, and just yeah, riffs everywhere. Memorable songs. All their albums sold really, really well. They were a huge draw on the concert scene and just influenced a generation of guitar players, bass players, and drummers who wanted to stretch out and really play some more aggressive music. Have to include Cream here. Absolutely. And to me, I don't think that Eric Clapton was ever quite the same player after Cream. I think, I really like the Blind Faith stuff and Derek and the Dominoes, but it's like almost after that, it's almost like he just did not want to be that guitar god guy, and we all still wanted him to be that, which is a shame. But it's the way it goes. All right, number 11, because things go up to 11. I'm going to talk about a band that has been one of the mainstays of the genre of music they play in for so many years. It's like it's one of those bands you can always depend on. That band is Iron Maiden since like 1980, right? One of the big bands of the new wave of British heavy metal movement to emerge from that and become like a stadium band, consistently selling albums, selling out concert stages all over the world. One of the greatest and biggest metal bands on the planet for so many years, so many albums. Yeah, you could say what you want. Maybe you don't like their more recent output as much as the classic 80s albums, and I get all that, right? Because their way of doing things a little bit different now, long drawn out songs, long albums, right? But man, that first album, Killers, Number of the Beast, you know all the rest, right? Power Slave and all that kind of stuff. So many great albums. And one of the great frontmen of all time. You got the great twin guitar attack of Adrian Smith and Neil Murray. Yeah, just such a great band. I'm gonna go with Peace of Mind as my favorite album from Maiden. That's kind of been my favorite Maiden album for many, many years. But I gotta say, kind of like with the Whitesnake thing, I feel that like Killers is like getting ready to overtake it. I love Killers. I think that was my entry point into Iron Maiden, and it's great and it gets better with age. So I don't know. Peace of Mind may not be my favorite Maiden for very long, but Maiden has to be on this list. Number 10. All right, another band that's plays in the same kind of spectrum as Iron Maiden. They've been mainstays on the scene since the early mid 70s. They're still going, right? Got lineup changes and things like that, but they're still going strong, still releasing great music, and some of their albums are some of the most influential heavy metal albums of all time. That band is none other than Judas Priest. All right, here's what many consider the classic lineup of the band. All right, Ian Hill, Dave Holland, KK Downing, Glenn Tipton, and of course Rob Halford. Yeah, Screaming for Vengeance, British Steel, Hellbent for Leather. My personal favorite is Stained Class, right? Sin After Sin, Sad Wings of Destiny, Rock and Roll. I've got a newfound appreciation for Rock and Roll after that, hearing that amazing remix. Defenders of the Faith, Point of Entry, Turbo, whatever you like, the news, Firepower, the new stuff. Love it all. A classic band. And again, probably, next to Black Sabbath, probably the most influential heavy metal band of all time. Right. So, yeah. Mainstays. All right, next up for pick number 9. So here I have a very interesting dilemma. So here is a band that had many different lineups, and the first lineup, which some people still consider the definitive lineup, is all British. Then they had a couple different other lineup changes and things like that, and then they brought in two Americans to make it kind of like a UK US phenomenon. They're still a British band to me. They always will be. And that band is, of course, Fleetwood Mac. Here's the original Peter Green led era of the band, which is basically a British blues band, blues rock band, whatever. Okay. John McVie and Mick Fleetwood, right? Of course, that's where you get the Fleetwood Mac, right? Founders of the band, still around to this day, right? Um, then Play On is my favorite album from the early part of the catalog, right? The Bob Welch era is great too, as well. But of course, like I said, they joined up with Stevie Nicks and that big tall guy right there, Lindsey Buckingham. And all of a sudden, you got the Fleetwood Mac album and Rumors, and they are absolute superstars, eclipsed anything that they did during the Peter Green era. Totally different kind of music. The blues is long gone, playing this kind of like California rock and pop type of thing. I mean, Rumors is hard to deny. What an amazing album that is. So yeah, I have to acknowledge both of these lineups here because I think they're both so noteworthy and so important. I mean, the early Fleetwood Mac so important on the kind of the British blues boom of that time. So had to mention both of them. All right, number 8. Let's go with a band. I mentioned them before in passing. We got to circle back to them because I think they're without a doubt one of the great UK bands of all time, whether you call them a heavy rock band, a pop band. Some people like to call them a prog band, right? Theatrical rock. Um, they defy classification. Of course, that band is Queen. And the only lineup, really. I mean, yeah, we know after Freddie died, they brought Paul Rogers in, but really the only lineup of the band. All right. These four cats right here: Roger Taylor, John Deacon, Freddie Mercury, and Brian May. So many great albums. Of course, one of the endearing songs of all time, one of the great songs of all time, Bohemian Rhapsody, right? Lots of other singles, right? The early stuff is heavy proto metal. Then they got into the more theatrical stuff, incorporating like waltz stuff and pop, right? Then more heavy rock to finish out the decade. Then doing rockabilly and funk stuff, and then doing other weird stuff. And then, of course, if we lose Freddie, and that's kind of the end of things. But man, just such an amazing band. Sold so many albums, so many hit singles. Another band that I go back and forth on what my favorite albums are. Of late, I have been going with the first Queen album, self-titled Queen. It's their heaviest album. It's got some amazing songs on it. A lot of times, A Night at the Opera is my favorite. A lot of times, Sheer Heart Attack is my favorite. I've been leaning on that quite a bit of late. Regardless of what your favorite Queen album is, there's something for everybody in the catalog. So yeah, amazing, amazing band. Next up. All right. One of my absolute favorite bands. I know many of you who know me well have been watching and waiting and saying, Pete, we know how much you love the band that has all these different marks in their history. That is correct. That band is Deep Purple, Mark II, Ian Gillan, Ian Pace, John Lord, Roger Glover, and of course, Mr. Richie Blackmore on guitar. One of the great lineups of all time. This lineup right here produced albums like In Rock and Fireball and Machine Head and Who Do We Think We Are, The Great Made in Japan. And then later on, of course, you got Perfect Strangers and House of Blue Light, right? Um, as well as Battle Rages On, right? That would be the last album of this original configuration here. In between, you got Mark One with Rod Evans and Nick Simper. You've got the Mark Three with David Coverdale and Glenn Hughes. You got more the next Mark Four, which had bring Tommy Bolin in place of Richie Blackmore. You have the whole Steve Morse era. You've got now, a new era, right? So whatever you like, they're one of the great British bands of all time. Heavy rock, blues rock, whatever you want to call them, hard rock, great band. That whole Hammond organ meets loud, aggressive guitars with the great vocals of Gillan or whoever's singing for the band, right? I love Coverdale's fronting the band as well. Yeah, one of the great heavy rock bands of all time. And of course, they were going to make my list. Absolutely have to. All right, next up for where are we at? We're at number six. For number six, this is another one of those original kind of British invasion bands. And, you could make an argument over which of these bands was the most important. I think there's one that always really kind of comes to mind and gets picked over the others. But to me, you got to put the Who right up there, right? And another one of the great lineups of all times, four absolutely essential individuals that, when you take one of them out of it or you take two of them out of it, it's not quite the same. Keith Moon on drums, the first guy to leave the lineup, right? Of course, he died in the late 70s. It was never quite the same after Keith died. John Entwistle on bass, Roger Daltrey on vocals, and of course, the great Pete Townsend on guitars and vocals and songwriting and all that kind of stuff. What do you call the Who? They're just a great rock band, right? At times they're hard rock. They did pop too as well earlier on. They did lots of singles and things like that, and kind of like a novelty, whatever. But man, Tommy, Who's Next, Quadrophenia, doesn't get much better than those three albums back to back to back. And there's a lot of other good albums in the catalog, but right, those are the big behemoth albums. Um, yeah, such a great band. I'm going to go with Tommy today. I have picked Quadrophenia. I have picked Who's Next in this discography. They're always my three favorites. I go back and forth on which one is my absolute favorites. And some great live recordings from the early period as well, from the early 70s, late 60s, and mid 70s. A ferocious, ferocious live band. So, yeah, got to go with the Who here. All right, we're at the top five, people. All right, for my number five, this is a band. Gee, are they prog rock? Are they psychedelic rock? What exactly are they? I've had conversations and had arguments both ways about this particular band because they kind of don't really fit anywhere. Um, they are just what they are, and what they are is ultimately Pink Floyd. The early stuff is totally 60s psychedelia. You could make an argument that some of their early mid 70s stuff is prog rock. It's straight rock. It's still psychedelic. There's some pop in their music. Um, how do you describe Pink Floyd? It's space rock, right? Space rock, the originators of space rock. Maybe more so. You could say Hawkwind didn't quite make my list, but Hawkwind's in my honorable mentions. But yeah, you could arguably say that Pink Floyd were the first space rock band, and Hawkwind just kind of ran with that, right? But just an amazing band who sold a gazillion amount of albums. And whether you favor The Wall or whether you favor Dark Side of the Moon, one of the great albums of all time, whether you favor Wish You Were Here or Animals or Metal or Uma Guma or, you know, any of the other ones, right? Because there's quite a few others. Ultimately, this is one of those bands that no matter what type of music you like, everybody likes Pink Floyd. Metalheads love Pink Floyd. People who love pop love Pink Floyd. General rock fans love Pink Floyd. Jazzers love Pink Floyd, right? It's one of those bands that appeals to pretty much everybody. My favorite album by them is Animals. Has been for a million years. I think Animals is an absolute work of genius. I absolutely love it. So that's my number five. My number four. All right, another band that probably people are waiting for. It's like, Pete, we know they are, if they're not your favorite band of all time, they are number two, and they have been either number one or two for much of my adult life, even when I was a kid, actually. So we're going back like 45 years. This band has absolutely grabbed my attention from the first time that I heard them, and I have had a love affair with Black Sabbath ever since. One of, if not the most important heavy band of all time. We don't get heavy metal if it's not for Black Sabbath. Arguably, we don't really get Judas Priest if not for Black Sabbath. I think Priest and Sabbath were the most important bands for the future of heavy metal. But without Sabbath, you don't really get Priest, in my opinion. And of course, the original four piece of Tony Iommi, Bill Ward, Geezer Butler, and Ozzy Osbourne. Again, one of the greatest lineups of all time. You can make the argument that when they brought in an American on vocals to replace Ozzy, they brought in a better singer. No one will deny that Dio is a way better singer than Ozzy, right? Ozzy's just got that it factor. And really, there's no better or worse. It's what you prefer, right? But I would say that I love the Dio version of the band just as much as the early version of the band. But there are iconic albums from this lineup of the band, right? That debut, Paranoid, Master of Reality, Volume 4, Sabotage, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. I mean, man, what a run right there. I know a lot of people love Technical Ecstasy and Never Say Die, right? I'm not as big on those albums as the other ones. And you got Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules, right? And Gillan comes into the band for Born Again, and there's way more after that. But yeah, this lineup for me is the iconic lineup of Black Sabbath, and my favorite album from this lineup of the band, or from this band in general, and one of my favorite albums of all time is Master of Reality, which took over from Volume 4 just about a year ago as my favorite Black Sabbath album of all time. I've always loved Master Reality. It always was right up there with Volume 4, but I finally was like, you know what? I think these days I just appreciate that album just a little bit more. So yeah, but yeah, amazing band, and so important. So important. All right, the top three. Top three probably need no introduction. Number three, I'm going to go with the Rolling Stones. They've been called the greatest rock and roll band of all time for a reason. Millions and millions of albums sold, tons and tons of hit singles, chart-busting tours, the gossip, the rumors, the stories, the drugs, the women, you name it. Problems, getting in trouble with the law. Just so iconic. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, the dynamic duo forever, still doing it to this day at, like, 80 something years old or whatever they are, right? Just an amazing band. Of course, I love the lineup with Mick Taylor. I think that the albums they did with Mick Taylor were absolutely spectacular. And that's the most musical for me that the Stones would ever be, although there's great stuff before and great stuff after it. And it's just, yeah, a legendary band. I've read so many Rolling Stones books, man. It's just a fascinating band to study and kind of dive into, and so many albums and so much good material, right? Sticky Fingers is my favorite Rolling Stones album. To me, that's where everything falls into place absolutely perfectly. So, but I could see anybody having a totally different favorite Rolling Stones album. So yeah, that's my number two. Sorry, my number three. My number two is the Fab Four, the Beatles. I know for many people will be their number one. You cannot deny the amazing impact that the Beatles had from the day one they burst on the scene with all those, pop singles early on, and just people fell in love with this thing called rock and roll, right? Coming from the UK, right? It's just they just captured the attentions of folks here in North America. And Beatlemania was just something that was just undeniable. Unfortunately, they didn't stick around for all that long. But man, all these great singles and all these like chart-topping albums. I personally love their more psychedelic era. Starting with kind of like Rubber Soul and that going forward. Man, so many great albums. Abbey Road is my favorite Beatles album of all time. I think it's just absolutely magical. But you could pick any of those albums, and it's not a wrong answer, folks. But yeah, I mean, just Lennon and McCartney, Harrison, and of course, Mr. Ringo behind the drum kit, right? All great players, all great writers, all singing. Yeah, a magical band that, for most people will probably be and arguably should be number one on this list. But there's one band to me that I think deserves to be number one, just because they have a little bit more longevity than the Beatles. They probably, again, I haven't looked at sales figures, but the amount of albums that this band that sits at my number one sold is astronomical, considering there's not a ton of albums, but every one of them's just sold like hotcakes, and tons of ticket sales, so influential, and all four of the guys in the band just so important to the music. That band, of course, is Led Zeppelin. John Paul Jones, the silent guy in the band, but you got to have him here, right? Jimmy Page, the man behind the guitar and songwriter supreme. Robert Plant on vocals, and one of the great drummers of all time, if not the greatest drummer of all time, Mr. John Bonzo Bonham. Yeah, so many legendary songs. You take a poll with classic rock fans and maybe name your 10 favorite rock songs of all time. How many Zeppelin songs will show up? Three, four, five, half, right? Half the top 10. Stairway to Heaven, Whole Lot of Love, you know, rock and roll. We can go on and on. Heartbreaker. So many endearing songs that this band has that so many people love. And whether you love the first album or the second album or the third album or fourth album or Houses of the Holy or Presence or In Through the Outdoor, of course, my favorite, Physical Graffiti, the great double album, one of the greatest double albums of all time. They're all great. There's not a stinker in the catalog. So many legendary songs. And again, one of those bands that could do it all. They played heavy rock, they played blues, they played folk. They did a little pop too. They did a little reggae. They did a little, tried some jazzy things. And yeah, they did it all. They did it all. And, again, one of those bands that unfortunately everything ended for them way sooner than we really wanted it to with the death of John Bonham. They were basically like, okay, that's it. That's it. We cannot continue without our drummer. And as much as we missed Bonzo, we were like, are we ready for a world without Led Zeppelin? I remember I wasn't at the time. We got used to it, right? But and then all through the years, any little hint of a reunion would be like a momentous occasion. And I think they will always be remembered as one of the greatest bands of all time. The debauchery, the stories, right? The busted up hotel rooms and the sharks and all this kind of stuff, right? Sold out shows and all, how rabid people get when any new footage gets resurfaced, new recordings, right? Bootleg concerts from throughout their career. Yeah, Led Zeppelin to me is the greatest British band of all time. And that's my list. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this little segment looking at my favorite and what I consider the greatest UK bands of all time. So, like I said, there are bands that are not making my list, not because I don't love them, not like I don't love Budgie and I don't love Saxon and Mott the Hoople and Dire Straits and Rainbow and 10 Years After and the Yardbirds and 10cc and XTC and Cathedral and Nazareth. Nazareth almost made my list, and Soft Machine and Hawkwind and Caravan and Gentle Giant and Marillion and IQ and Renaissance and Diamond Head and Satan, Tigers of Pantang, Angel Witch, Porcupine Tree. God, who else have I left off? Procol Harum, 10 Years After, Trapeze, Alan Parsons Project, Barclay James Harvest, UK, Supertramp, Caravan, Vandergraaf Generator. I love all these bands. Camel can't fit everybody, right? You have to pick like the 30 that not only are among some of my favorites, but also the impact, right? Like I would say like, on my list, T-Rex, The Police, Def Leppard. I like some of these bands I just mentioned in my own mention. I like them more, but I just can't, I have to look at it from two ways. Bands that I really like a lot, but also the impact that they've had, taking into account sales and, hit singles and longevity, with the songs being played on the radio and things like that. So I'm just trying to look at it from that perspective and just, jump starting certain genres of music and whatnot. So yeah, if we're strictly talking about just absolute favorites and forget everything else, I would have like all these, a lot of obscure bands and a lot of the stuff I just mentioned. People are like, but there are others that were more important to the UK scene, right? And I get that. So that's why I'm trying to look at it from both perspectives. We've had people asking for Canada. I'm going to do something similar, but a little bit different. Been talking with my good friend Chad Hutchinson, of course, my one of my cohorts over on In the Prog Seat. He and I have been talking about doing a Canadian-centric episode where we start looking at some of the great Canadian bands of all time, but maybe paying less attention to Rush because everybody knows how much we love Rush on this channel. Rush to me and to Chad are probably the greatest Canadian band of all time, right? So we're going to do a show all about, well, we know how great Rush is. But how about all these other bands? And we're going to try and give some love to some of these other Canadian bands that maybe didn't quite have the success as Rush did. Maybe not even at all. Maybe some of them won't even be household names to many of you, but we want to give them some love. So we're going to do a Canada show, Canadian band show that's really not going to talk about Rush at all. So if you're waiting for us to talk about Rush, we will acknowledge Rush at the beginning and say, yeah, we love Rush. They're the pinnacle, but we've talked about them enough. We know all about Rush. How about some of these other bands? So that's coming up in the not too distant future. So stay tuned for that. And visit us on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're on Facebook. We're on YouTube all together all the damn time. Please subscribe if you haven't already and click on that notification bell so you get alert of all of our content as a post. And please do hit the like button before you leave. Also down below, we got the links to our Ko-Fi page for channel donations, our merch page, our Cameo page, and the Sea of Tranquility membership options all down below. Thanks in advance for all your support, folks. It's greatly appreciated. We'll see you soon here with more stuff. I am Pete Pardo. List your 30 who you feel are the greatest UK bands of all time down in the comments below. Be interesting to see what other people pick. Maybe we'll have some crossover. Maybe we won't. Maybe there's some bands I completely forgot about. But like I said, there's some bands that I'm really not all that into that were huge UK bands that I didn't pick that I'm sure many of you will. So that's what it's all about. So yeah. So put that down below in the comments and we'll see you next time. I am Pete Pardo. Thanks for watching, everybody. Bye-bye.